From the JAMA Network, this is the JAMA Pediatrics Editor's Summary, a discussion of the most important articles published in the latest issue of JAMA Pediatrics.
Hello again, podcast listeners. This is Dimitri, Christakis, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA Pediatrics. With our monthly podcast, with me again, as always, is my friend, my colleague, and my associate editor, Dr. Alison Galbraith, coming to us from her new office at BMC. Good to have you, Allie. Welcome.
Hi, thanks. It's nice to be here in my new office.
All right. We have two interesting papers again today. Why don't you go first, as always?
Yeah, so this paper is called Changes in Body Mass Index Among School-Aged Youths Following Implementation of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010. It's a cohort study from Chandran and colleagues from a variety of institutions. So the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act was enacted in 2010 because there was concern and there was prior data that showed an association between school lunch consumption and increased obesity. And so the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act mandated improvements in nutrition quality in school meals, both like breakfast meals and lunch meals, as well as snacks that are sold in vending machines or in school stores. And that was to make the meals include more whole grains and fruits and vegetables and have less fat and sodium. It's a big deal because the school lunch program reaches like 30 million kids. And for those kids, it provides up to half of their daily calories.
And it's more frequently low-income children who are at increased risk of obesity and et cetera, right?
Yeah, to qualify, you have to have a certain income, which is pretty low. So the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act was passed in 2010. It was phased in starting in 2012, but it took a while. And so the USDA thinks that by around 2016, most all schools became in compliance. And there's been some data that have looked at how BMI has responded to that, and some showing that for low-income kids, there were improvements in BMI, but it hadn't really been studied broadly. So what they did in this study was use data from ECHO, the Environmental Influences on Children Health Outcomes program. So that's a consortium of a lot of different clinic and community-based child cohorts. So they use data from ECHO cohorts from 2005 to 2020, right before the pandemic, for kids aged 5 to 18 who had height and weight measurements. And then they looked at annual BMI Z-score trends before and after the full implementation of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. So they used that sort of index date that sort of defined the before and after. That was September of 2016. And then they adjusted for some demographic covariates, and they used the interrupted time series design. So what they found, they had over 14,000 youth from 50 ECHO cohorts around the country. And they did see a significant decrease in the annual change in BMI Z-scores after implementation of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act compared to before. And then they also looked at interactions by sex and age group and income. And that's what's sort of interesting is they found that this positive effect, this reduction in the BMI trends, was noted both for low-income kids, but also for higher-income kids. So across the board.
Meaning kids who weren't even eating the lunches.
Well, no, I mean, they're not eligible for the program, right? But they could still be eating. I think that's the idea that, they're changing the school lunches, but, other people eat the lunches. They just might not get
free,
it free and reduced. Yeah. So there seemed to be this kind of, I guess, spillover effect for, kids who might not necessarily be in the program, but are eating the lunches. And they didn't see other differences in the effect. There were similar like trends and improvement in BMI for either gender or for any age groups. I think there were some prior studies that didn't find an improvement for adolescents, with the idea being like, well, those kids might not eat lunch at school. They can go and get lunch someplace else. But this study did see improvements in adolescents as well.
Great. We have something that actually works to curtail the rise in obesity, right? Allie, what do you have to say about it?
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting? So I was digging a little bit deeper into this because there is some controversy about the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And in fact, there were some attempts to roll it back a little bit. I think there was some concern, about people who worry about food insecurity and hunger advocates worrying that, if kids don't like the meals, for example, there was some data that kids, when they took away flavored milk, kids weren't drinking as much milk. So there was some concern that if kids don't like these healthier meals, they aren't going to eat as much. And so they might be more food insecure. They might then eat more at home where it's going to cost their families more. And so there was a rollback actually in 2019 where they added back in flavored milk and said you don't have to have as many whole grains and stuff like that. So I think there is a little bit of controversy around it. But the other
Now
thing,
that is interesting, and that's beyond the paper itself. So I guess it warrants a follow-up study to see if that undid the demonstrable benefits from here.
well, right, what happens to food insecurity, right, with the Hunger-Free
Well,
Kids
what
Act?
happened to
Yeah.
food insecurity and with changing the options, did in fact some of the benefits go away? I guess it's interesting. I mean, are these kids actually not eating, or are they eating healthier meals? Really, what we need is some kind of a food diary. But I liked it because I sort of felt like, it reminded me of studies done by Bob Whitaker years ago, which said if you really give kids better choices, and that's what he did back then, they will choose healthier foods. But here you're not, I guess you're constraining their choices even more. And I sort of assumed they were eating lunch. It hadn't occurred to me that they would skip it. So that's interesting.
Right, there was some concern, I guess, about this is not in this study, but that kids are they throwing away some of the food because they don't like it? So it had a positive effect on BMI, but we don't know how it affected what the kids are actually eating, what they're eating outside of school lunch because how they feel about the school lunch.
Well, that's true. So you said a couple things. You said three things, I think. They may be more food insecure. They may be skipping lunch, let's say, in the worst case, which could put a financial
Mm-hmm.
burden on their families.
Mm-hmm.
But they are gaining less weight. It's not that they're making up the calories at home with
True, fair point. Yep. Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's food for thought, as they say. I hadn't thought about that wrinkle till you brought it up here because I was very enthusiastic about the study. We have so few evidence-based policies, and even more, we have so few interventions, certainly at scale, that effectively reduce BMI, that I was so enthusiastic about the study. Now you've given me pause. So thank you.
Well, no, I mean, I think that no, the study is valuable. I think that it's what the hard thing is that there's multiple outcomes that are affected. So obviously, like improving BMI is a really important outcome for kids, but there are other outcomes that might be affected as well. So I think this is a great study, and it can't answer all these other spillover questions.
Well, stay tuned. Hopefully, someone will follow it up and add additional variables. All right, so my paper is the effect of intranasal corticosteroids on quality of life and local microbiome in young children with chronic rhinosinusitis. It is, in fact, a randomized controlled clinical trial. And I have to tell you, Ali, as a part-time clinician, I took for granted that we had data from children that intranasal
I
corticosteroids work
know,
for chronic rhinosinusitis.
right? But there's apparently the data is not great in kids. So
Apparently, we've
yeah.
extrapolated as we often do from data in adults, and there have not been studies in randomized, or very, very few studies, I should say, in randomized clinical trials in children. And the other thing these authors did that I think is interesting is that they tried to, and we'll come back to this in discussion, look at mechanistic reasons for why steroids might work. And so there is apparently existing evidence or suspicion that the sinusoidal microbiome may play a role in the inflammation that's seen, and that a more diverse microbiome may be associated with less inflammation, and that children that develop inflammation may have a different, less healthy microbiome. There was an explosion, as you may recall, in microbiome papers. We published quite a few in
Hmm.
the microbiome heyday. I think it's still a very interesting area of inquiry, but TBD as far as I'm concerned about how it can be used in many cases clinically. Nevertheless, that was one of their hypotheses. And so they did a randomized controlled trial in children 4 to 8 years of age who had been diagnosed as having chronic rhinosinusitis. And they were randomized to receive nasal omeprazole for 12 weeks or a placebo. And it was once a day. And then they used a standardized questionnaire, the Sinus and Nasal Quality of Life Survey, the SN5. And then they also did a nasopharynx swab for the microbiome. So it was a blinded prospective randomized controlled trial, and they collected clinical symptom data 12 weeks later, and they found that there was a mean difference between the groups of minus 0.58 on the nasal quality of life survey, the 5-item thing. And of course, all of you as clinicians may be saying, what does that actually mean? So they dichotomized it in a separate logistic regression analysis, looking at a change of 0.5, which is considered to be clinical significant improvement, and did a logistic regression model which showed that in fact the treatment had an odds ratio of 3.33. So 3 times the odds, and that doesn't mean necessarily 3 times the relative risk of improvement, but a sizable effect size for a clinically significant improvement associated with using steroids. And then they also looked at the microbiome, as I said, and they found a significant difference there, that there was greater biodiversity or greater diversity, I guess, in the microbiome in the treatment group compared to the control group, which I also thought was interesting because I didn't know, it wasn't at all obvious to me how the use of steroids would promote
Right.
greater microbiome diversity in the nasopharynx. So that's what they found. And I guess the take-home message is those of us that have been using nasal steroids for chronic rhinosinusitis, they do in fact work. I'm not sure we can conclude, in fact, I'm sure we cannot conclude that they work by changing the diversity of the microbiome. This could be true, and unrelated, at least from this study.
But what they did find, though, it seemed like, so they looked overall and that an increase in the microbiome richness was associated with significant clinical improvement. I mean, that's not the randomized part of it, but then they also did, I think they found, tell me if I'm thinking about this right, there was a significant interaction between a change in the microbiome richness and the intervention effect. So, because at first I thought, okay, who cares? Not who cares, but what, like, if the microbiome is more rich, what does that mean? But it did seem like they also found positive effects of increasingly rich microbiome,
right,
clinically.
It doesn't prove, though, that's the causal mechanism, right? Those could still be true, and unrelated.
Right.
But it is interesting. And of course, one does wonder, let's play this out, because that's what I was doing in my own head. If it was the microbiome, let's say, that somehow gets deranged and that causes chronic rhinosinusitis, and then you revert the microbiome back to greater biodiversity, why is it that when you stop the steroids, as we often do, symptoms recur, as they often do? Does the microbiome then revert back for some reason in some children? I mean, I'm just curious about that.
Well, whatever made it do that could do it again after you stop holding it at bay with the steroids, I guess.
Right, which is sort of what I was wondering. So if it's exposure to allergens that causes both changes in the microbiome and symptoms because of immune regulation.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm curious about what the mechanism is, but nevertheless, I thought the finding was interesting. And this is, I think, to me, one of the challenges with the microbiome work, right? Because we find these associations, we posit that there's causality. The real test would be change the microbiome, modify the microbiome in a child's nose without the use of nasal steroids. Through, I don't know, yogurt swabs or something, and see if that improves symptoms. But they didn't do that, and I don't know that anyone will ever do that particular study. Nevertheless, I don't think this is a randomized controlled trial that will change practice, because I think most people are already doing this. As I said, it sounds like you were. But it's always nice to have an evidence base for what we do, and it's clearly not the case that everything that works in adults does work in children. So I bear that in mind as well. We would have published this if it was a positive study, which is reassuring to clinicians, and we would have published it if it was a negative study, which would frankly be...
Well, that would have been more interesting, right?
Yeah, it would have been a game changer, I think, because it would have made us wonder if we've been inappropriately prescribing nasal steroids for quite a long time.
But the harder thing about this is the challenge for kids versus adults is to get your kid to do a nasal spray every day. Like, I don't know how they got these kids to agree for 12 weeks to, do this every day. They didn't really talk about how compliant people were, but I think that's kind of a rate limiting step in the pediatric population.
Well, these are you're saying because some measure of compliance, these are 4 to 8 year olds, so it wasn't up to them. I mean, the parent presumably squirted it up there, but you're right. It's not a particularly pleasant experience. I've been on nasal steroids myself. Yes.
Right. If this is an effectiveness, not an efficacy trial,
I see what you're saying.
How would it really go?
Yes. Very good point, Dr. Galbraith, as always. So I want to thank you all once again for listening, and thank you, Ali, for your time. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. The audio team also includes Mary Lynn Ferkaluk, Audrey Foreman, Lisa Hardin, Hannah Park, Shelley Steffens, and Dr. Linda Brubaker, Senior Editor Multimedia. Thanks for listening, and you will hear us again next month. Bye-bye.